talk is about acceptance testing and using Fitnesse for acceptance testing. I'll be speaking English for most of the talk. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to raise your hand and stop me. I'll be happy to answer questions. How many people in their current project are using Fitnesse? Oh, okay. Good. How many are doing acceptance testing?
Automated?
Automated acceptance testing. So the first question we need to answer are, what are acceptance tests? Who's doing unit testing? Test-driven development. Okay, many of you are. Okay, so it's easy to compare acceptance tests to unit tests. Unit tests are written by developers. So all you developers out there, you should be writing unit tests as you're developing your code. They're written for you, by you, so that you know that your code works the way you intended it to work. Acceptance tests are written by the customer. And I use the term customer loosely. I'll go into that further later. They're written by the customer, and their intent is to test features of the system. Not so much that the code works the way you developers wrote it, but to make sure that the feature works the way the customer wants it. Acceptance tests are a criteria for completion. So the customer has an idea in their head of how they want the system to work. They have a feature they want you to implement. So they're going to write a test and give it to the developers. And it specifies how they want this feature to work. This test becomes criteria for done. In Mary's keynote, she used the term done, done. When the acceptance test passes, your feature is done, done. Acceptance tests are also a means of communication. In order to properly implement acceptance tests, it forces developers to talk to customers, to talk to testers, and to talk to business analysts. It's amazing how many teams you see out there where these different departments do not communicate. When you implement acceptance testing, it brings everybody together so that you are always communicating. And we'll see later. When you're creating acceptance tests, you have to communicate. As you're implementing, often developers have questions, and so they have to ask questions and communicate there. And during execution, it communicates functionality of the system. And acceptance tests are feedback. Feedback is one of the core values of Agile. They provide a source of data which you can view to understand how the project is working. I have a graph here. Imagine that you keep track of all your acceptance tests for a system. So this is assuming you are doing acceptance testing, and you keep track of all the acceptance tests. These white bars represent the number of acceptance tests in your project. And you can see at the beginning, it's probably not well understood how exactly the system should work. So there's only a few acceptance tests, but it's enough to start development. As time goes on, the number of acceptance tests will increase because we have a better understanding of what the system should do. Until at some point we've defined pretty much most of the features that will be delivered in the system. Now that can change, of course. In Agile, we want to embrace change. That can change. But we have a pretty good idea of how much complexity there is in the system. We know how much work there is to do. That by itself is good information, because lots of times you don't have that. Now, also track the tests that are passing versus the tests that are failing. Okay, so here we have the green bars. The green bars are the acceptance tests which are passing. Now, at first, there will be very few passing tests because you have barely begun development. But as the project moves on, the number of passing tests increases. By looking at the green bar compared to the white bar, you have a very good indication of how healthy the project is, how complete is your project. Here we can see that we're about halfway done with our project. That's good information. This is information that you should post up on your wall, in your team room or in your office, and everybody who walks by can look at that chart and see how healthy your project is. They get a good idea of what's going on and whether you're going to finish on time. You can extrapolate this curve to try to see where it's going and see if you're going to implement all the features by the deadline. So acceptance tests provide healthy data, which you should share with everyone. Acceptance tests are also a critical piece of Agile. This is your traditional waterfall. So we do some analysis, design, and implementation, but we do it in phases in waterfall. You shouldn't be doing this. So some analysis for a couple months, then some design, and you don't start writing code until later on in the process. In Agile, we're not getting rid of these phases so much as we're just combining them together and doing them very rapidly over and over again. So in one iteration, you're going to do some analysis, some design, and some implementation. Now, it might not be separate processes or phases, you're doing it all at the same time, but you are doing a little bit of each of those. Acceptance tests are critical for this because the input to these iterations is tests. Every story that the customer provides to you should come with at least one acceptance test. And it should be failing because the feature has not been implemented yet. So at the beginning of each iteration, you have a set of acceptance tests as input to the iteration, and as output, you have a set of passing acceptance tests. This is backwards, right? We're used to writing code and then throwing it over the wall to the testers and let them deal with it and find all the bugs. We're reversing it. Those tests now come first. They are the input to our iterations. This is test-driven development. We are driving development through tests. So there's two types of tests, right? Yesterday I gave an example of unit testing, test-driven development, and that's a very fast cycle. We're writing lots of tests in less than 5 minutes or so. Acceptance tests are on a higher level. Okay? We iterate, or the cycle is between iterations. And acceptance tests are a criteria for done. Again, as Mary said, done, done. When a feature passes all of its acceptance tests, it is done. Which means that every story must have at least one acceptance test. And a story is not done until it passes all of its acceptance tests. Now this takes discipline. It's easy to finish developing a story. I'm a developer, I speak from personal experience. It's easy to write code and look at what I built and say, yeah, that's about the story, that's it. But sometimes it doesn't pass the acceptance test. There's extra things in those acceptance tests that the customer wanted that maybe I didn't think about, or maybe I didn't implement. So it's very important that as developers, we make sure those tests pass. And it's very important as customers that we do not sign off on stories until they pass their acceptance tests. This has to be enforced to get the value out of it. Manual acceptance test. So these are tests where there may be more traditional tests where you have a script and someone actually has to sit down on a computer and use the system to test a feature. The thing about manual acceptance tests is there are no manual acceptance tests. Why not? Any ideas?
You have to run this test every time you make something to make sure, to be sure at the end of the iteration, all these tests are passed. You are passing this.
Yeah. You have to run the tests at the end of each iteration.
No.
Yeah. And the thing about manual tests is they're time consuming. They take a lot of time versus automated tests, which you can just press a button and they run. Manual acceptance tests take a lot of time and a lot of manpower. And when you're tight on time, like if you're right by the deadline and you need to release your code, what are you not going to do? Right? Manual acceptance tests, it's too time consuming. We cannot have any manual acceptance tests. Which brings us to the fact that tests are automated. Imagine that you had a button, and when you press that button, a green light comes on if the system is working as specified, and if it doesn't work, a red light comes on. So I've worked on systems where there has been this button. And it's very interesting what happens. And you put it in an area where everyone can see it, and everyone wants to press it. And you walk up to it, and you think, yeah, I wonder if the system is working right. Well, let me see. You press the button, you wait, it's green. I'm just happy. I wonder if it's still working. Press it again. It's green. It's a refreshing feeling to know that the system is working. If you had this button, how often would you press it? All the time. Yeah, every time you change the code, you'd press the button. Who would press the button? Everyone. Testers, developers, managers. Everyone would want to press this button to see that the project is healthy, to see that all the features work. In an Agile project, where you're implementing acceptance tests, this should be your goal. Your goal should be to have one button to kick off all of your automated acceptance tests, and you know that the system is working. To achieve this, it's not necessarily easy, but to achieve it, you need a language which is high level, such that the customers can understand it and possibly write your tests. And it has to be very precise because we need to execute the system. So it has to be high level, yet precise. There can be no ambiguity. ¿Cómo se dice ambiguity?
Ambigüedad.
Okay, thank you. No ambiguity, because the last thing you want is to hand a test to a developer and for that developer to read the test and go, what does this mean? It has to be very detailed so that the developer can step through and say, okay, I know exactly what I have to do, and they go off and code. We like to use the term examples. Acceptance tests should be examples of how the system should work. So you might want to use example data, and then process the example data and check the results to make sure that you get the results you wanted. Furthermore, the acceptance tests have to interact with the system. Right? If they're not interacting with the system, then you're not testing anything. So they have to be able to execute your code. We'll get back into automating a little bit later. When you take this into consideration, that acceptance tests are a criteria for being done with a story, and that they are automated, you get this term, which you may have heard, called executable specification. And imagine your specification, and I've seen some before, a document or a binder full of pages which specifies the system. Imagine if that binder executed. It not only described the system, but you could execute it, and it told you whether the system worked like that or not. This is documentation, and it's proof that the system works. It makes you think differently about testing. It puts quality first, right? You're no longer just handing over pieces of paper, you're handing over tests, right? The quality of your system is built into these tests. You're putting the quality first. And there's no ambiguity, right? The documentation, these acceptance tests, the specifications describe exactly how the system will behave. So who writes acceptance tests? The customer. This is the term I've been using. And I know, Mary, that you don't like this term. And I use it very... Oh, you do? Okay, excellent.
I don't like private.
Oh, okay. I use the term loosely to mean anyone who has the vision of what the product should look like, how it should behave. And this could be many people. It may actually be the customer, the one who's reaching out of his pocket and giving you the money to develop it. It might be him, but I don't see that often. It might be a tester who has the vision of how things should work. He might be the one who's writing tests. It might be the business analyst, and I see this frequently. A business analyst is someone who understands the requirements. They probably talk to the customer and understand what the vision is. They might write the tests. And the term product owner is used a lot, so I put that up here as well. Whoever has that vision, that is what I call the customer. The person who's writing the tests should have that vision. That is the customer. However, customers are often not technical. And writing tests can get technical. Remember, they have to be detailed, they have to execute your system, so it can be challenging for them. Well, developers are technical people, so maybe the developers and the customers could get together and write those tests together. They could pair acceptance test, if you will. And often, business rules are fuzzy or hard to understand. And as a developer is implementing a feature, they might have questions. So they'll often come back to the customer to say, what did you mean in this test right here? How am I supposed to implement the code here? So it forces communication between the developer and customer again. And every so often in your projects, you come to a head where you need to make a solid business decision about what you're going to do in functionality. And those decisions can be hard to make. So what this forces the team to do is escalate the problem and talk to people higher up in the company, maybe the company owner or CEOs or whoever. It brings attention to the project at multiple levels in your organization and establishes communication on multiple levels, which is also healthy. This is all tying into communication. To do acceptance tests properly, you have to have lots of communication at multiple levels. So I have an exercise for you. I know we haven't gotten into how to implement tests yet, but I want you to think about this. We're going to build a feature to log into a system, similar to this login screen here. You're going to type in a username and a password and press a sign-in button, and if you get the right username and password, you are logged in. If you got a wrong username and password, you did not get logged in. It's a web application. User credentials are stored in the database. And if you successfully log in, you are redirected to a welcome page. Okay, now think about that for just a minute. How would you test this? Think about what steps you would use to test this. Okay, so let's look at some possibilities. Maybe your first step was something like this. Direct the browser to the login URL. And I'm going to say that that's not the right step. You might have said that we need to enter the username Wallace. I'm going to say that's also probably not the right first step. Why not? The first thing you have to do in your tests is to build a testable environment. You might have to load up your database. You might have to put some test data in your database. You need to prepare the system for testing. There's a common pattern that you'll see in writing tests, which we call the BOC, build, operate, check. The first thing you're going to do is build a testable environment. Then you're going to operate on the system, and then you're going to check the results. Make sure that you got the results you expected. Okay, so let's try again. Maybe your first step was, let's add some users to the system. Probably not the right first step. You might have said, enter a value into the username field. Again, there's something missing here. We need to be specific. Remember, our tests cannot be ambiguous. We need to use real data. So use concrete examples and no ambiguity.